In 1893, a German archaeological expedition excavating the ancient mound of Sippar uncovered a fired clay disc buried inside the remains of a collapsed temple archive. At the time, however, no one realized the true significance of what they had found. The artifact was officially catalogued as a ceremonial object and placed alongside incense burners, fragmented pottery, and other ritual items. The intricate markings covering its surface appeared decorative, so researchers assumed it held artistic rather than informational value. Its face was divided into 8 concentric rings, each marked with small notches placed at uneven intervals, creating a pattern that looked ornamental rather than purposeful. For nearly a century, the disc remained in storage in Berlin. Then, in 1987, an astrophysicist visiting the collection requested permission to photograph it while researching ancient calendar systems. During that examination, the scientist noticed something generations of linguists had overlooked for almost 90 years. Those tiny notches were not decorative at all. They functioned as timestamps. Each one was paired with clusters of cuneiform text that, when translated correctly, spoke neither of gods, kings, nor harvests. Instead, the inscriptions described the sky itself fading into darkness, not as a poetic metaphor, but as a literal event. The same Sumerian word used for a lamp being extinguished appeared repeatedly throughout the text. Beside every timestamp was a numerical count, recorded in the Sumerian base 60 system, indicating how much of the living world vanished when that particular darkness arrived. Curiously, the museum's internal documentation from that period contains surprisingly little information. Records suggest that a preliminary translation circulated among 3 staff linguists in 1988, but after that, the official paper trail becomes remarkably sparse. When a junior researcher later attempted to push the project toward a complete peer-reviewed publication during the mid-1990s, the proposal reportedly stalled in committee and never moved forward. Not long afterward, the disc itself disappeared from the museum's main exhibition hall. It was quietly relocated to a restricted study room where outside researchers could only gain access by providing written justification for their request. By itself, none of this proves that anyone deliberately suppressed the artifact. Museums routinely reorganize collections, misplace paperwork, and move objects between storage facilities. Still, the timing is difficult to ignore. Just as the astronomical meaning of the disk was beginning to emerge, access suddenly became far more limited. That coincidence has kept independent researchers returning to this mysterious artifact for decades. 8 rings. 8 numerical sequences. 5 of those 8 rings appear to correspond with events preserved in Earth's geological history, and they do so with a level of accuracy that seems impossible for a Bronze Age civilization that possessed neither telescopes, satellites, nor any understanding of deep geological time. The 6th ring, however, doesn't point to something that already happened. If you've stayed with the story this far and genuinely enjoy exploring mysteries like this, consider subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps support future videos more than most people realize. This isn't the version of history you'll typically find in textbooks. It's the version that rarely receives funding or serious attention. What makes the Sippar Disc stand apart from the many other Sumerian astronomical tablets sitting in museum storage is its overall structure. Most surviving tablets serve practical purposes. They recorded star positions used to predict seasonal floods, tracked planetary movements for scheduling religious ceremonies, or documented the routine astronomical observations of a civilization deeply fascinated by the heavens. The Sippar Disc follows a completely different pattern. Rather than functioning as administrative bookkeeping, it appears to document a recurring cycle of global catastrophe. Even more remarkably, the dates encoded within it don't span human history. They stretch across hundreds of millions of years. The first ring corresponds to an extinction event approximately 445 million years ago, aligning remarkably well with what modern paleontologists identify as the late Ordovician extinction, a disaster that eliminated the majority of marine life on Earth. Current science attributes that extinction largely to a rapid glaciation event, something no Bronze Age society should have possessed the scientific knowledge to predict or model. The second ring closely matches the late Devonian extinction around 375 million years ago, a prolonged, multi-stage biological collapse whose details were only reconstructed by modern scientists after studying deep-sea sediment cores. The third ring represents the largest extinction event of them all. It aligns with the Permian extinction approximately 252 million years ago, the closest Earth has ever come to losing nearly all complex life. More than 90% of marine species disappeared during that catastrophe. The accompanying inscription contains a phrase that translates roughly as, "the breath of the world stopped." It's an unusually specific description considering that modern geological research now links the Permian extinction to an enormous increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide and a catastrophic depletion of oxygen throughout the oceans, a theory that scientists did not develop until the late 20th century. The fourth ring corresponds with the end-Triassic extinction around 201 million years ago, an event now associated with massive volcanic outgassing that rapidly altered Earth's climate. The fifth ring aligns with the asteroid impact that marked the end of the Cretaceous period approximately 66 million years ago, the extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs and remains the best-known catastrophe on this list. 5 rings. 5 mass extinctions. Each one falls within a margin of error that statisticians who have examined the data describe as extraordinarily unlikely to occur by coincidence alone. That raises an obvious question. How could a civilization that appeared only about 5,000 years ago accurately encode both the sequence and approximate timing of extinction events separated by hundreds of millions of years? Only a handful of explanations seem possible. The first is simple coincidence, that modern researchers are forcing ancient symbols to fit present-day scientific knowledge through pattern matching. That argument may be convincing if only a single match existed. It becomes far more difficult to defend when 5 separate events appear in the correct chronological order, each accompanied by descriptions that resemble the actual mechanisms responsible for those extinctions. For that explanation to work, the Permian inscription would have to accidentally describe oxygen collapse. The Cretaceous section would have to randomly reference fire and impact. The Triassic passage would need to land within only a few million years of the accepted geological date. And every one of those coincidences would have to occur on the very same artifact. Statisticians who have analyzed these correlations independently continue arriving at probability estimates so incredibly small that, for practical purposes, they approach zero. The second possibility suggests that the Sumerians inherited this knowledge from an even older civilization, a tradition passed down across countless generations, with most of the connecting links eventually disappearing from history. Civilizations rarely emerge already equipped with sophisticated mathematics, advanced calendars, and fully developed systems of astronomical observation. Something almost always comes before those achievements. Yet in the case of the Sumerians, archaeologists have never conclusively identified what that earlier source might have been. The third explanation is the one many archaeologists find most uncomfortable, to the point that the Sippar Disc is often omitted from conference discussions altogether. According to this possibility, whoever first recorded the information on the disc was not reconstructing ancient events by piecing together clues left behind. Instead, they were recording knowledge that had been given to them directly by something, or someone, that already knew exactly what had happened. That naturally raises another question: if this knowledge truly existed, who was supposedly responsible for passing it on? According to Sumerian cosmology, the answer lies with a group of beings known as the Anunnaki, skyborn entities who, the ancient texts claim, arrived during a very specific celestial alignment. The Sumerians wrote that these visitors introduced humanity to an already complete civilization almost overnight. Writing, irrigation, astronomy, systems of law, and organized kingship all appear within an astonishingly short period, with little archaeological evidence of the gradual development historians would normally expect. This abrupt leap is often referred to by researchers as the Sumerian problem, because the archaeological timeline doesn't easily fit the standard model of slow cultural evolution. Interestingly, the Sumerians never claimed these achievements were their own inventions. Instead, they credited Anu, the supreme deity of the heavens, with descending to Earth during a rare alignment of Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn in the constellation of Taurus. According to the texts, it was during this single event that both knowledge and kingship were bestowed upon humanity. Modern astronomers have examined that particular planetary alignment and confirmed that it follows a real, measurable cycle, occurring approximately once every 7,200 years. If someone chooses to read the Sumerian account literally rather than dismissing it entirely as mythology, it appears to describe a contact event connected to a recurring astronomical window rather than a purely symbolic story. The Sippar Disc seems to treat that recurring alignment as something even more significant. Each concentric ring doesn't simply record the timing of a catastrophe. According to the accompanying text, every ring marks the return of that same celestial alignment. Even more striking, the inscriptions make it clear that the alignment and the catastrophe are presented as one and the same event, not two unrelated occurrences that merely happen to share the same date. This is where the story becomes considerably more unsettling. According to a 2011 reanalysis conducted by a team of German researchers specializing in orbital mechanics, the sixth ring corresponds to an alignment expected to occur sometime within the next several decades. Their calculations placed the most likely window in the early 2030s. The seventh and eighth rings point much farther into the future, thousands of years beyond our own lifetimes. The sixth ring, however, is different. If those calculations are correct, it concerns our own era rather than some distant generation. From this perspective, the Sumerians weren't simply assigning meaning to catastrophes that had already happened. They embedded what appears to be a forward-looking prediction into the very same artifact. And according to supporters of this interpretation, the portions of that prediction that can be compared with Earth's fossil record already appear to align with 5 separate extinction events. The Sumerians were not the only civilization to describe history as a repeating cycle of destruction and renewal. The Maya, for example, recorded immense cycles of creation and collapse through their long count calendar. In their traditions, each previous world ended in a specific catastrophe before a new one could begin. Ancient Hindu cosmology divides history into 4 great ages known as yugas. Each age ultimately ends in collapse before the next cycle begins, and the present era, the Kali Yuga, is described as a time marked by moral decline and an approaching dissolution of the existing order. The Hopi speak of successive worlds that were destroyed by disasters involving fire, ice, and floods. According to their traditions, humanity now lives in one of the final worlds while watching for the signs believed to announce the next great transition. Ancient Egyptian priests told stories of Zep Tepi, or the first time, a primordial age before recorded history when, according to their beliefs, the gods still walked among humanity and established the pattern that later civilizations would follow. Norse mythology contains its own parallel in the form of Ragnarok, the foretold destruction of the existing world, where both gods and humanity face catastrophe before a new age begins. These civilizations developed independently of one another. They lived on different continents, spoke entirely different languages, followed separate religious traditions, and were separated by thousands of years. There is no widely accepted historical evidence suggesting they borrowed these stories from a common written source. Yet advocates of this theory argue that they all preserve the same underlying pattern. According to that interpretation, the world eventually ends, a remnant survives, and civilization begins again under new guidance. Even more intriguingly, many of these traditions seem to place humanity near the closing phase of the current cycle rather than somewhere comfortably in its middle. Returning to the Sippar Disc itself, the surviving text surrounding the sixth ring is incomplete, but the remaining passages are surprisingly direct. The inscriptions describe seas overwhelming the land, fire descending from a darkened sky, and approximately 2 out of every 3 people being swept away. Those who survive are said to gather on mountains and elevated plateaus while the lower regions disappear beneath rising waters. The text continues by describing an extended period of darkness lasting for generations before anything resembling social order is restored. When stability finally returns, it is said to come from the same direction as the original knowledge, guided by figures associated with the lineage of Anu. The language itself doesn't resemble poetry or symbolic prophecy. Instead, it reads almost like a procedural record, precise, matter-of-fact, and strangely clinical, as though the writer were documenting events already witnessed rather than imagining possibilities for the future. One small detail beside the sixth ring receives surprisingly little attention from many translators. A brief cluster of glyphs has been interpreted roughly as the kept remainder, followed by a numerical value. When that value is converted from the Sumerian base 60 numbering system into modern notation, it corresponds to approximately 500 million. Researchers disagree over what that number actually represents. Some believe it refers to the expected number of survivors remaining after the catastrophe. Others suggest it represents a target population, the level at which humanity is ultimately intended to stabilize once the cycle has concluded. If that second interpretation were correct, and considering today's global population exceeds 8 billion people, it would imply a reduction of well over 90% before reaching the equilibrium described by the inscription. According to this reading, the reduction is not portrayed as an unfortunate side effect. Rather, it is presented as the intended outcome of the cycle itself. Supporters of the theory also point out that the same figure, 500 million, appears in a much more recent and highly controversial context. In 1980, an anonymous individual using the pseudonym R.C. Christian financed the construction of the Georgia Guidestones, a monument consisting of massive granite slabs erected in rural Elbert County, Georgia. The true identity of the sponsor has never been publicly confirmed. Carved into the monument were 10 guidelines written in several modern and ancient languages. The very first inscription called for maintaining humanity below a population of 500 million people, describing that number as being in permanent balance with the natural world. To this day, no one has ever conclusively identified who commissioned the Georgia Guidestones, what organization, if any, stood behind the project, or why the creator selected that particular population figure instead of any other. What makes the comparison especially intriguing to supporters of this theory is that the same number appears beside the sixth ring of the Sippar Disc, a text that was not fully translated until years after the Guidestones had already been erected. If there is any connection at all, proponents argue, it would be difficult to dismiss it as a simple coincidence born of independent invention. The Georgia Guidestones remained standing for 42 years before they were severely damaged by an explosion in 2022. Around that same period, independent researchers across online forums began comparing the population figure carved into the monument with newly circulated translations of the Sumerian disc. Officially, no one has ever been identified as responsible for the explosion, and within only a few weeks, the remaining fragments of the monument were completely removed from the site. Supporters of the theory also point to another similarity. The Guidestones were designed with several astronomical alignments, including a narrow channel that allowed observers to track Polaris and carefully positioned notches that marked the solstices. In that sense, the monument functioned as both a calendar and a celestial reference point, remarkably similar to the way some researchers interpret the Sippar Disc. Whether that similarity reflects a shared source of knowledge or simply independent design remains entirely open to debate. According to the Sumerian interpretation, the force responsible for triggering these recurring catastrophes was known as the Unmaker. The texts describe it as a wandering celestial body following an extremely elongated orbit, periodically passing through the inner solar system and disturbing everything in its path. Rather than directly colliding with Earth, it was said to produce gravitational disruption, shifts in Earth's rotational axis, and waves of impacts caused by smaller objects being scattered along its wake. Modern astronomy has never directly observed such an object. At the same time, researchers cannot categorically rule out the existence of undiscovered massive bodies in the distant reaches of the solar system. In 2016, astronomers at Caltech proposed the existence of the hypothetical Planet 9 after noticing unusual clustering among several distant Kuiper belt objects. The proposed planet has never been seen directly, but its existence has been inferred from its apparent gravitational influence. A separate Harvard study published in 2020 explored the possibility that an even more distant and massive object could occasionally disturb comets and asteroids, sending some of them toward the inner solar system. Neither research team suggested they had discovered the Sumerian unmaker. Both studies remained firmly within conventional astrophysical models and avoided any connection to ancient mythology. Even so, advocates of this interpretation argue that if an object with a highly elongated orbit truly exists, periodically passing through the outer solar system every several thousand years, it would resemble the mechanism described in the ancient texts surprisingly well. If that were true, the search for the so-called unmaker may have been taking place for years, only under entirely different scientific terminology. Some researchers also point to geological evidence they believe reflects a similar disturbance in Earth's relatively recent past. Approximately 12,800 years ago, the planet entered the abrupt climatic episode known as the Younger Dryas. The cooling occurred with remarkable speed and coincided with widespread extinctions of large mammals across several continents over what is, in geological terms, an extremely short period. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and many other species disappeared within only a few centuries following environmental changes that would normally be expected to unfold over thousands of years. Some studies examining isotopes within debris from that era have suggested the presence of material that may have originated in the distant outer solar system. Supporters of the theory argue that such chemical signatures could indicate objects arriving from regions beyond Neptune rather than from the much closer asteroid belt. They further point out that the Younger Dryas occurred almost exactly halfway between the previous alignment described in antiquity and the future alignment associated with the sixth ring of the Sippar Disc. If that timeline is meaningful, they argue, then whatever caused the earlier disturbance never truly disappeared. Instead, it would still exist somewhere beyond our view, continuing to exert subtle gravitational influence while gradually moving toward another close approach. Supporters also encourage people to examine changes they believe have become increasingly noticeable over the last 2 decades. They point to earthquakes occurring in regions traditionally considered geologically stable, noting that monitoring stations in parts of the eastern United States and central Australia have recorded seismic sequences unlike those documented in the modern instrumental record. They also highlight increased volcanic activity in places such as Iceland, Indonesia, and Chile, where several volcanic systems have become active more frequently than historical averages might suggest, including volcanoes that had remained dormant for centuries. Another observation often mentioned involves Earth's magnetic field. Scientists have confirmed that the magnetic field has been gradually weakening over time, leaving the planet somewhat less protected from solar radiation and charged particles. Geophysicists have monitored this trend for decades, although the precise reasons behind some aspects of its evolution remain an active area of research. Taken individually, none of these observations demonstrates the existence of an approaching celestial body. However, supporters argue that when viewed collectively, they resemble the kinds of gradual effects one might expect long before a massive gravitational object became directly observable. They also note that detections of near-Earth objects increased significantly between 2010 and 2020 through NASA's asteroid tracking programs. Several of those objects were only discovered after they had already passed close to Earth because they approached from the direction of the Sun, a region where ground-based telescopes have very limited visibility. The Chelyabinsk meteor that exploded over Russia in 2013 arrived from precisely that blind spot. Although the object measured only about 20 meters across, the shockwave injured more than 1,000 people and shattered windows across an entire city despite providing only seconds of warning. Supporters argue that even a modest increase in the size of such an object, from the scale of a house to something closer to the size of a city block, would dramatically increase the destructive consequences. The Sippar Disc contains one additional inscription beside the sixth ring that many researchers consider especially intriguing. It is a glyph commonly translated as, the return of the keepers. According to Sumerian tradition, the keepers were described as tall humanoid beings with elongated features and reflective eyes. They were credited with teaching humanity the foundations of civilization before departing, with the promise that they would return when the great cycle began again. Similar figures appear throughout many ancient traditions. In the Book of Enoch, they resemble the Watchers, beings said to have descended to earth, shared forbidden knowledge with humanity, and intermarried with human beings. Ancient Vedic literature tells of celestial beings known as devas who traveled in flying craft called vimanas, bringing knowledge of astronomy, governance, and advanced learning before returning to realms beyond ordinary human reach. Hopi traditions describe mysterious underground guardians, sometimes referred to as the Ant People, who sheltered survivors during previous world-ending catastrophes and are expected by some interpretations to provide protection again during a future cycle. Later Mesopotamian civilizations, including the Babylonians and Assyrians, preserved their own versions of these celestial figures through court astrology, often treating unusual events in the sky as possible signs announcing their eventual return. Although these traditions use different names and come from civilizations separated by vast oceans, different languages, and thousands of years of history, supporters argue that the same underlying pattern continues to appear again and again. Another detail they frequently point to is that these mysterious beings are almost never portrayed as invading conquerors. Instead, they are described as overseers, figures who return to observe, evaluate, or supervise something they initiated long ago rather than arriving to wage war. Viewed in its entirety, the Sippar Disc doesn't appear to describe a series of random disasters. According to this interpretation, it outlines a recurring maintenance cycle, one that is scheduled rather than accidental and designed to prevent whatever is developing on Earth from exceeding some limit the system is meant to enforce. The ancient texts never explain why such a limit would exist. Nor do they reveal whose interests that limit is ultimately intended to protect. One possibility is that it reflects a form of resource management operating on a scale far beyond human understanding. Another is that the cycle serves to correct gradual changes within a species that was never entirely natural in the first place. Then there is the interpretation many people find the most unsettling. Perhaps humanity was never the true focus of the cycle at all. Perhaps we simply happen to exist while something much larger is being maintained for reasons that have little to do with us. The disk contains 8 concentric rings in total. According to those who study it, humanity now stands near the beginning of the 6th cycle. The 7th and 8th rings point to events thousands of years into the future, far beyond the lifetimes of anyone alive today. Interestingly, the intervals between each successive ring appear to grow longer, leading some researchers to speculate that the entire cycle may be gradually slowing down over immense spans of time. Even so, the 6th ring is the only one that directly concerns the present generation. The surviving inscriptions suggest that recognizable warning signs appear years before the event itself rather than only days beforehand. Among those signs are rising sea levels, increasing seismic activity along already unstable tectonic boundaries, skies darkened by volcanic ash, a growing number of visible fireballs crossing the atmosphere, and reports of unexplained aerial phenomena becoming increasingly common. Supporters often note that reports of unusual aerial activity have risen significantly since around 2017. They also point out that the United States government has publicly acknowledged investigating unidentified aerial phenomena while offering no definitive explanation for many of the reported incidents. Some of those objects are described as performing maneuvers that appear inconsistent with the known capabilities of conventional aircraft. Of course, it's entirely reasonable to reject these connections. Many critics argue that researchers are simply stretching a series of unrelated coincidences until they resemble a meaningful pattern. That skepticism is both understandable and healthy. Even so, advocates of the theory believe one question remains difficult to dismiss completely. How did a Bronze Age civilization, without telescopes, without any concept of deep geological time, and without a scientific understanding of fossils as we know them today, produce a sequence that appears to mirror 5 major mass extinctions spanning hundreds of millions of years? And how did those descriptions seem to align not only with the chronological order of those events but also, according to this interpretation, with the mechanisms responsible for each one? Whether someone views the 6th ring as genuine prophecy or simply as a projection created by later interpreters, the date associated with it continues to move closer regardless of what anyone believes. Time itself doesn't pause to wait for agreement. Eventually, humanity will discover whether the Sippar Disc was nothing more than an extraordinary historical curiosity, or whether it was a warning intentionally preserved for whoever would one day uncover it. And if that moment ever arrives, we'll finally learn whether the disc recorded a future that was still avoidable, or one that had already been decided long before anyone living today ever existed to read its message. If this story made you stop and think, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who loves ancient mysteries, lost civilizations, and the unanswered questions history still can't explain. You never know. One conversation could lead to a completely different way of looking at our past, and perhaps our future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next mystery.